Okay, so full disclosure, I'm Kim Hill's ex-PhD student, so we're not exactly independent data points here. But let's start with, I really like this study by Nivet. I don't know if you've seen it. She's a criminologist. She put together a really nice comparative study of homicide rates per 100,000 per year, the common measure, cross small-scale societies. And what kind of really surprised me when I first saw this is you really kind of see a bimodal distribution here. And I kind of do this for a living, put these graphs together. I've never seen a bimodal graph for any human trait. We talk about pygmies versus non-pygmies, but stature is unimodal. We talk about patrilocal versus matrilocal societies, but residence patterns are. So there's something special here, and we can maybe think about two sort of attractor states, right, going in different directions here. And I think we can say that these societies here on the right, these warlike societies, maybe overgeneralizing here, but they've gotten into these vicious cycles of revenge violence. And if you break that cycle, then you become on the peaceful side here, right? So thinking a little bit more about how humans differ, how to understand this variation. One, also how humans differ from chimpanzees. What we haven't mentioned yet, and I think is really important, is thinking about the evolved human social structure, which sometimes gets the name of a metagroup social structure, right? So, and I think that comes back to marriage. So we know marriage in all society is a human universal, and lots of rules and regulations that say who people can and can't marry, who they should marry, and the system, right, of regulated reproduction, right, these marriage norms, often spans across multiple groups, right? And I think the interesting thing about that, kind of a rough diagram here, you can imagine how having these marriage alliances that tie together multiple villages, right, does something really interesting that chimpanzee communities can't do, right? And that you can create alliances that are across communities and potentially bring together forces, numbers of men primarily, that are larger than you could get just from one particular community, right? So you can imagine this is like a block of villages that can then go to war against a different block of villages, right? And that can scale all the way up to even nation-state warfare, right? So I think this is an important aspect. And we did a study recently. Shane was first author with some old data from Napoleon Chagnon for the Yanomamo. And in that project we did, it was really obvious how important this metagroup social structure was. It's a classic picture of Yanomamo men going off on a raid. There are at least 3 different villages, probably 5 plus is a good guess. So these warriors, they've come together from different communities to create a larger force, right? Then the classic South American, raiding pattern is to put this large force together and then go and attack at dawn, try and kill, turns out on average only one person, and then get out of there as fast as possible, right? So it's very much a low-cost strategy. But again, you get this, it's a metagroup social structure that you can put together larger forces. And I think this is important for understanding how this violence can really scale up. And it may also lead to, if you can create peaceful alliances, it can work and maybe actually act to decrease, get people on the peaceful side if it really is just about exchanging mates and information and goods. But I think it has a dark side, it's sort of two sides of the same coin, right? You can increase your cooperative sphere across multiple villages, and that can then lead to pretty large-scale violence, and the problem is it kind of comes back and forth, right? Okay, so another interesting thing we found in that paper, so this is sort of thinking about the metagroup social structure in the short term. Also an interesting long-term component to this with the Yanomamo that we found that these men who have killed, they get a special status called Unochi, and a lot of times a particular victim will actually be killed by multiple Unochi. So multiple Unochi are associated with a single victim, right? And we can look at the relationships amongst those, what we call co-Unochi, or simply men that have killed together. And what's interesting, you look at sort of where they've come from originally, these men are oftentimes coming from different villages at birth, at some point begin to raid together, right? And then you can see after, a successive number of multiple killings as a dyad, then come to live in the same village almost unanimously, right? And so you can almost think of this sort of co-Unochi as like a long-term alliance between men, right? They come from different places, come together, same village, and then oftentimes are exchanging wives and things between their patrilines, right? And that's almost the formation, essentially, of Yanomamo villages. I think it was really pretty interesting. Okay, let me talk about a different study here. I've spent a lot of time looking through ethnographies for lowland South America. And this kind of led me to two sort of separate projects here. One is just trying to quantify, well, how does violence vary across societies? And there we found there's 11 studies. I don't think that any more exist. And I think even more interesting is to do an event level analysis of actual raids, okay? So what we found here for these 11 studies, Kim already talked about several of these. Probably a lot of these are familiar to all of you. But I think the interesting thing to look at here is this percent violent deaths, right? So it has a pretty large range of variance, right? What we'd expect from that first slide. Groups like the Chimane, no active warfare, they're going to be low. And then at the extreme, we have the Waorani, arguably the world's leaders in rates of violence, where the revenge violence was essentially ongoing. If someone was killed, the revenge raid would happen sort of that moment, right? And they were probably sending themselves to extinction, such a high rate of these incessant raiding events, right? But the average there is 30%, right? That's kind of a normal number. What does not vary that much, if you look across these studies, is the percent of these victims that are male, right? So roughly 70% male, similar in chimpanzees, similar to a lot of studies even in the US, where you get kind of this 2-to-1 male to female ratio. So it's interesting how that does not vary much, and that does for sure. So what I tried to do originally was classify these different studies into where is external warfare important, that is going to raid people of a different ethno-linguistic group, and where is internal raiding more important. It turns out to be kind of hard, and we could kind of argue if I've gotten these wrong. And that's what led me, what I think is actually a much more interesting analysis at the level of individual events, okay? And there it is very easy to classify. Okay, did someone died, right? Were they killed by someone within their own village? Is it internal warfare, Yanomamo style, killing someone of your same ethno-linguistic group, or is it external, right, outside? And here's the sort of sample size here. And I think it's not easy to classify these events. And then we have some other data that we get associated with these raids. And so we can look at what percent are taking captives, right? And then how many women are captured, and then you can estimate the number of women captured per raid. Okay, and interesting, it comes out relatively similar between internal and external, something like 0.6 women captured per raid, which seems maybe not insignificant, right? There's maybe something going on there, a potential benefit. And then also we coded treachery. Treachery turns out to be, it's not used all that often, but you can show if it is used and it's effective, it can create a really large body count. So maybe a lot of you have heard about the famous feast on the Yanomamo. You invite people to come to your party and you get them drunk, and then it leads to a slaughter, right? But it's all very, it's well planned beforehand, right? So here's the frequency distribution here at the different levels. You can see it's common just to kill, the modal pattern here is to just kill one individual. Occasionally you do get pretty large body counts here. No, this isn't on a log scale here. Large, some events here are happening within village where quite a few people do die. Essentially, this is the beginning of a war, right? And then this village will then fission, and then you get this cycle here generally of internal warfare going on. And the largest event here is 300 people being slaughtered, completely wiped out by an enemy group, right? External warfare. So this is all indigenous on indigenous warfare here. So we did some pretty simple analysis here, but I think are kind of important, telling us some interesting clues about what's going on with these raids. So these are body counts, the Poisson regression here, and you can show that the body counts are higher in external. So there's probably more warriors going on these external raids, even though it's harder to really show that. But certainly the body counts are higher for external versus internal raids. And I think a really interesting analysis here we're able to do, even though the sample size is much smaller, But you can link these raids together. So there can be what's considered the original grievance, right? And then the counterattack to that, right? Which would be the revenge raid. And it can be kind of hard to know really when these start, but there usually is some sequence that's going on that we can capture in the ethnographic record. And those body counts in revenge raid are higher, right? Which show there's some increase in intensity to these cycles of revenge raid. Like those guys came and killed one of us, then we go and kill two of them, and it can, through time, has a tendency, at least statistically, to increase, right? And also treachery works. If you can convince people to come to your party, you can kill more of them, right? And there are various ways to use treachery. Invite people to go hunting, and you end up shooting the guy in the back, right? It comes in different forms, right? Okay, so kind of to summarize up here, what I think we can say is that this bimodal distribution I think is really interesting. I'll leave it up to you guys to help me explain. But my sort of maybe oversimplistic interpretation here is that some sides get sucked into this revenge psychology of, it's kind of this hard to break cycle of they killed one of us, we need to go kill one of them. And if you can break that, right? And in lowland South America, it has been broken. Acculturation, the outside world shows up. Lots of people die of epidemics, might be part of the story. But in general, warfare has mostly disappeared, right? I think the metagroup is really important. We hadn't talked about this yet, but I think it offers the opportunity, at least, to really increase the scale, not only of cooperation, but also of conflict up to higher levels beyond the local, just community on community. It's now groups of communities that are going to war with other groups of communities, right? Treachery works. This increasing vicious cycle of revenge killings seems to be going on. And I didn't talk too much about this. You can code these different ethnographic accounts of these raids, and revenge comes out. In fact, I probably shouldn't even list these other things because they really are way down there. Basically, why people are raiding is, they say, for revenge, right? And there might be lots of triggers that go into that. But I think if we can explain the revenge psychology within humans, we would make a lot of progress in sort of understanding these patterns. Okay, so Kim kind of stole my thunder here. He was talking about these uncontacted groups. Here is, I think, by far the most interesting because everything I've shown so far is very much ethno-historical data, but as Kim mentioned, there's still some semblance, at least, of tribal warfare going on with these uncontacted groups. And this one particular group, which is right here on the border between Brazil, they're more or less right there in Brazil, but sort of near the border with Peru, these Nawa groups. You can see through time the number of sightings, thefts, and attacks that these people have been perpetrating. So we call them uncontacted, but really there's all sorts of contacts going on. They just haven't been peaceful contacts, right? They've killed at least a half dozen people, primarily since 2005. Just last week, they completely ransacked a settler's house. They took everything from it, all the clothes, all the tools, even the kitchen sink, apparently. Completely cleaned them out, right? And what I think is really fascinating about this group is that they're clearly growing in size, okay? So we've been tracking them with satellite imagery now for 15 years. And this group, so yeah, here's a nice example. If you pay enough money, you can track the satellites to go wherever you want, right? So here we track the satellite, and you get image the same day, okay? So here's Longhouse here, Longhouse right here. You can see their fields. You can measure it. And then with satellite imagery, Landsat imagery through multiple years, you can show how they've been moving. So they were over here 2005, 2009, 10, 11, 12, 13, and that image I just showed you right here is from this year, right? So they're moving this way. And what's pretty interesting is this group used to be much closer together, and this half is moving this way, and this half is moving this way through time, right? So they're kind of, which I interpret, we don't really know what their relationships are, but generally when you see groups moving away from each other, they're probably hostile to one another. We certainly know they're hostile to all their neighbors, including the settlers. And it's the one example I know of a group that's actually growing through time. I mean, they're clearing like 10 to 20 hectares every single year of forest, okay? So this group is probably, I don't know, I'm guessing maybe around 400 people total, probably roughly split into two groups of 200 or something like that. So look for a lot more incidents like this, because we here have a growing group, bumping up into their neighbors. It's a recipe for disaster, I think it's fair to say. So this is one of the last places where tribal warfare seems to be a problem still. For the most part, it's gone, right? So I think that's all I have. Time for questions then, hopefully. Huh? There's Matt.
And let me just add that because Kim Hill didn't have any time for questions, if you want to direct questions to Kim as well.
That's not fair. He used his time.
This is great because I actually had the same comment for both of you, but I'll feed it to when you were begging, not begging, suggesting that we look for a theory for what's going on with killing your spouse. The best theory I've heard along those lines is Zahavi. I mean, he's famous for the handicap principle, but he had a related thing called bond testing. And if you look at the original paper, he's talking about birds leaning on each other, but he acknowledges like his kids and his wife and his dog for inspiring this. Because why is it the people you're closest to are the most trying to you? It's because the strength of your bond is absolutely critical for them to know that, and they can only find that out by sometimes exceeding it. So they need to know the threshold. And so I heard him give a talk just last year at an economics meeting in Zurich, where he was extending this out into even things like suicide and also, in the birds, like why do baby birds make so much noise? They're running the risk of getting predated, but they want to encourage their parents to bring them food faster, and they're trying to shift that investment. So the point is that there's a lot of investment right at that edge, and then occasionally you fall over it. And I'm not saying that's certain, but I'm just saying that's the best theory I've heard in this area, and that might be part of what's going on. So it's called the bond testing theory. It is Zahavi, the same guy that did the handicap stuff, and it's related to handicap. It's costly signaling about, it's trying to derive a signal from the most important people in your life that your fitness depends on, about exactly how important they are. And I think it's not a million miles away from some of the stuff that Roughgarden has talked about in terms of when you increase communication, then you can find better equilibria.
Go ahead, Kim.
Just really quickly, it seems to me that the idea that killing your spouse is signaling is likely, but I can think of a lot of different theories. And the one that I think comes up really obviously to a lot of people is, this gives a message to my next mate that you better not mess with me because I killed the previous one for messing with me. Mm-hmm. That seems like it would be a tempting signal, but that can backfire. When I interviewed Unochi women, I interviewed close to 300 women and asked them whether they found men more attractive who had killed somebody. They said, oh no, we would never marry those guys because they beat their wives and they're dangerous. And so the outcome of the few men, we had 5 spousal homicides right there, is that I think 4 of those 5 men never married again. In other words, women are smart enough that they're not going to get into that. Yeah.
You don't want to die, right? So the idea is that you're getting close to the edge, and occasionally by accident you cross over the edge because you're trying to be at the edge. So that the majority of the time that you're expressing that behavior, you're not quite killing, right? So that's the more of the time that you're squawking in the nest, you don't get
All right, let's take one more question here at the back.
Thanks. Does the bimodal distribution hold up if you only look at external homicide? So you take out all the individual violence. And related to that, has anyone looked at what the ecological correlates are of the differences in homicide rate or lethal?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I don't know. That particular data set has included all sorts of homicides, which include all the kinds that Kim talked about, plus external and internal. My impression is it would still hold. In fact, it might be even stronger if you just looked at external. Now, the question of ecological correlates, I don't know. I've heard some rumors. People in this room maybe are looking for these. I can tell you one big one is acculturation. So part of the reason you see that sort of bimodal distribution, a lot of those groups on the peaceful side have what an anthropologist might even to take out of the sample because they're too acculturated. We can argue whether or not we really should. I think it's sort of interesting to see, to look at that as a process of acculturation. I mean, Kim showed it too, violence dropping when the outside world shows up. That's certainly what's gone on in South America. The other one is, subsistence. So people talk a lot about hunter-gatherers being lower than people with, land and crops and animals that you can steal. So there's probably something going on there, even though some hunter-gatherers can be quite violent. So, but yeah, I think there's some room there for some analysis to be run. I think we have now more and more data that we could sort of put into a pretty interesting analysis if anyone's interested in. I'd like to work on a project like that for sure. Yeah.
How confident are you in? Oh, thanks. How confident are you in those codings you made of whether a raid or an attack was sort of an original provocation versus a revenge provocation? And do you think that Group A and B,
they're not
if you
going to
ask
agree,
them,
right?
they'll agree on those codings?
Yeah, in some cases you can kind of, there's ethnographies from both sides, and you can kind of match up what's going on. And you can see how, if there's disagreements, it kind of makes sense. But yeah, it is kind of a risky business, in part because sometimes the accounts of how many people died will differ between the two. And then I can't remember how we actually handled that. I might have taken an average or something like that. So the victims know really well how many died, right? And then sometimes it seemed like the aggressors, they might either be exaggerating, saying that more died than actually did. You assume the victims would know better and would be more reliable. So yeah, we had all sorts of data. It's a risky business for sure, and yeah, we just kind of, with most of these kind of things, try to do the best we could. But.
I guess the question is more trying to get to is whether the two groups would parse the sort of social conversation in the same way, saying, oh yeah, when they attacked us, that was out of revenge for what we did to them before that. Or where they had reviewed that group revenge attack from the perspective of Group A as a totally unreasonable provocation that came out of nowhere. And so now that's something we have to seek revenge on.
Yeah, I would say, I have to look at it more carefully, but roughly half, they seem to kind of agree. Like they realize the reason they were being, counter-revenge here is because we, but the other half, not agreeing on what that original grievance was is really common, right? Because the other side always started it, right? They always did something wrong.